I want to welcome, and please help me welcome to the stage from the Bush Foundation, President of the Bush Foundation, Jen Ford Reedy. And from Four Bands Community Fund, the Executive Director there, Lakota Vogel. So, you know, we've framed this conversation sort of around money, which is that thing that, you know, people don't often want to talk about. But I want to start there and get that out of the way a little bit, and then we're going to talk more about leadership in general, because that's really why I've asked you two to come, because I admire the way that you're breaking a whole bunch of old models about leadership. So I want to ask you about that a little bit, just to give you a forewarning. But money. So, you know, philanthropy in rural communities is something that comes up a lot, questions about that a lot in our learning network and in the communities that we work in. So, Jen, I want to start with you and just ask, you know, you've been thinking about philanthropy differently at Bush Foundation since you came on board, and I've really admired how you are approaching that. So two things I want to ask you about around that. One is this philosophy of no moat philanthropy and what that might mean, and something that jumps out at me in a couple of things I've read that you've written in the last couple of years, this willingness to follow as a foundation instead of leading but following. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the concept of no moat philanthropy for me comes from actually a really commonly cited description of what a foundation is within our field, which is basically a big pile of money that lots of people are trying to get to, right? And so then within the field of institutional philanthropy, which are those institutions which have resources to give away, there's a dynamic because of that can be super awkward, right? There's some group of people who have control over, get to make the decisions around resources, and then there are a whole lot of people who would love to have those resources to be able to put them to wonderful use in a variety of ways. And there are more people who would like to have those resources than we have the availability or the ability to support. And so quite often what happens in our field then is that you create a moat around yourself where you don't want to be out, frankly, at events like this where people are going to pitch you your ideas and you're going to have to feel really awkward about saying that you don't have a way to support them. Or just the work it takes to process a bunch of ideas coming at you, and maybe you don't have much staff capacity and you just rather keep those ideas out than have to take the time to process all of them. So we've thought about what can we do intentionally to not have a moat, to just accept and embrace the fact that there is some awkwardness in the dynamics around funding relationships. But if we're not out talking to people at events, if we're not out and having conversations with folks about exciting things happening, then we're not going to be great at our jobs. We're not going to have the intelligence, we're not going to have the perspective to be able to make great decisions about what we're doing with our resources. So we try to do that in a whole bunch of ways, things like sponsoring this event, and I have 3 colleagues here at the event. We do office hours around the region. We have hotlines for people to call in to talk about their ideas. We make sure that whenever we can, we give money away in an open process where anyone can apply. There are a number of ways to make sure that we are in relationship to the extent we can be with the people in the region that we serve. The particular idea of followership is mostly around wanting to be a good collaborator and partner with others, and knowing that if you always think your idea is too clever or you're always too focused on the thing that you want to get done, then you're not available to be part of something bigger. And being willing sometimes just to say, that's an amazing idea, it's not what we were planning to do, it's not exactly what we would do if we were designing it ourselves, but we'll sign on because there's power in having us work together on this idea.
Great. And so what are you seeing? What's changing in the communities that you're partnering with around their attitude around philanthropy? or their approach?
I don't know. I do know that people appreciate some of the things that we do, or express appreciation for openness. We are in some ways a funny situation where we're place-based as a foundation, but the place is really big. I mean, it's Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and 23 Native nations. So we are not truly of any community that we work in, any community that we're giving the resources in. So it's a being available and wanting to make sure we're using our resources in ways that are smart, but we're not really embedded as part of the change in any community. So what we look for then is feedback on, are the ways in which we're structuring our grant making useful to people? Are we giving money to things that actually matter? And then are we making good decisions, and how are we doing in our relationships with those people that we do fund?
So one last quick question for you before I ask Lakota a couple questions. What advice would you have? I mean, a lot of people in the room are probably on like their local community foundation, or almost everybody in the room is applying for grants from your organization and a bunch of others all the time. What advice would you give people who are on those local boards or on that economic development corporation?
Fundraising is not easy for most organizations for a whole different set of reasons. And to give very general advice is probably actually giving not very useful advice, because each organization has their own set of assets that they can really play up and focus on in terms of who you're able to develop relationships with, what kind of appeal you're able to make to different kinds of donors or institutional funders. So I think it's about really trying to think, okay, for this unique thing that we are doing, this unique contribution that we are making to the world, who would value that? Who do we think should value that? And how can we get ever more creative about getting attention from those people, those institutions, and finding ways to tell our story and show our impact that will connect with those folks.
Great, thank you. I should say in full disclosure that we are a grantee of the Bush Foundation at Dakota Resources. Dustin on our team, who's also a lawyer, wasn't here, so he didn't remind me to say that.
Can I just jump in real quick?
Please.
I don't know a lot of the folks in the room, but I kind of feel that I'm a little bit of a proxy for all the practitioners in the room. But when I sit next to Jen up here, I want to ask questions that I feel like maybe other people might in the room, but I also want to lay a little bit of groundwork of how I feel when I hear foundation leaders talk about issues they have with philanthropy, and then there's me, who is also a Bush Foundation awardee. So I think that sometimes when I hear the talking about this, she described the moat, and sometimes when I'm an economic development, provider in my community, I also feel like I have to think about the moat that's around my organization and allowing my clients to access what I do. So I find similarity there, but this quote has been with me for a while, and I just wanted to bring it up because I think what I love about being rural is the momentum that we all feel within our communities. And I just mentioned, I heard you say die, like small communities die, and it really made me reflect. But I also know as rural folks, we have a sense of fatalism that most people don't have. So if my dad is out ranching or on the four-wheeler and he gets bit by a rattlesnake, it's likely that he will die because we don't have hospital resources nearby. And when I say that to my urban partners, they're just shocked, like that it's otherworldly to them. And I think fatalism, to me, parts of us can die, but then like same thing with a community. And when I defined where I came from, I come from a community called Promise with no zip code, no physical geographical boundaries. It was a way of life and a way of living, and that's how we defined ourselves. So you could meet the guy 60 miles down the road and he would say he's from Promise. And there's no way to physically define that. And so getting to my point is saying we have momentum about us as rural people and dedicated to our community, and sometimes trying to find the right philanthropic partner isn't always a priority. It's about maintaining that momentum and love of place. So the quote that I was mentioning was from Senator Lewis, and he kind of challenged my generation and just said, we've got all this media and technology at our fingertips, and my generation isn't doing much about it. So in the civil rights movement, he said, they sprayed water at us and we kept coming. They put the dogs at us and we kept coming. They gave us grants and we stopped coming. So it just kind of made me sit back and think, like, we do the work we do not because of grant sources or philanthropic partners. We do it because of this underlying theme of being a rural practitioner. And that's what we hold on to do our work. And sometimes the fatalistic part of us realizes I might lose my IDA or my individual, development accounts because funding was cut. But that part will die temporarily. But then there's other pieces that I can grow or thrive within, to continue the work of the community that I love. So to say to you, Jen, like, I think I do believe the partnership idea. Like, we'll come in partnership with you to the work we want to do, but it's not always that power dynamic, and I appreciate the Bush Foundation of truly being a partner with us when we know what's going to work and what's not going to be. So, but we want this to be a conversation, so
Thank you.
Trying to.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's good. And I think a couple things there. One is realizing there's 62,000 nonprofits in our region. So for us as a Bush Foundation, we are profoundly unhelpful to almost all of them every single year, right? And there's a humility in that of saying, so then, what can we do, knowing that we actually will only get to do a very small amount of it. But I think there's an occupational hazard in philanthropy of thinking in terms of money, right? You give you the grant and you stop coming, right? And that really what philanthropy at its best is always trying to do is enable and support people to get something done. And that's how change happens, is through people working to get something done. And you can start thinking in terms of grants and start thinking in terms of institutions and actually lose that much more fundamental truth that the only way change happens is by the people who have a vision for something to be different and are willing to work for it and bring other people along. And I think the quotes or other ways to remind yourself of that, I think, is really helpful, because that is truly how we're going to make any change.
Look, thank you. Lakota, I read something recently that you, a quote from you in an article where you said, so first off, Forband's Community Fund, by the way, has made over 1,000 micro loans. And a lot of them are like $500. And I heard you say we make, paraphrasing the first part, we make these loans to local business people, but you said we're trying to be nation builders. What we're trying to do is be nation builders. Can you tell me a little bit about what that means for you in the rural place that you call home?
So I work mainly in a reservation economy. So to us, nation is about a different citizenship level that we have within it. But at a rural level, it's about love of place, and we're trying to build the place that we love. And the place that I serve has 26 self-defined communities. So whatever client, wherever they come from, the community that they define themselves from is the one that I respect, and that's where they come from. So when we talk about nation building, it's about building the future generations to take over what we have as resources locally. But it is about love of place, and I like the analogy of sort of when we like the money to stick. We're giving the money out, but we're not trying to extract any resources from the communities. When we do our microloans, the money sticks because the people stay local and they benefit the local economy. So it's about this like stickiness factor that we really enjoy in the small micro-lending work that we do.
Something you said to me when we were talking on the phone the other day that really struck me, that I wonder if you might share a little more about. You said it's more important than ever today that rural and reservation become one. Can you talk about that? What do you mean by that?
It's a value system. I think that in the national framework of the work that we all do, we need to have instead of an othering conversation about the differences between the economies, which there are some fundamental differences just based on systems. But basically, we all need to understand that rural is rural, and we're all fighting for the same dollars. But also, we need to tell our story nationwide about the impact we can have in our rural communities. And to me, that story is always about scale, and like how do we overcome scale in rural communities, and that ask of us always trying to scale. So I think that reservation economies and rural economies are one and the same when I do my advocacy work, and I hope that we can talk more along those lines than talking about them differently.
Great. So I want to shift from talking about money and nation building to something a little more personal. And I wonder if the two of you could just talk a little bit with each other, and we'll just kind of watch you, about leadership. One of the words that I've heard you both use when you talk about leadership is vulnerability and being vulnerable as a leader. And so I wonder if you can just share a little bit with us about what that's like for you and how you practice that.
I think you have more. She's prepared for this.
Well, we talked about it a little bit this morning. We had breakfast together, and we talked about this idea of vulnerability, and some of it was like, what does that even mean? And are we meaning the same thing when we hear that term? And what I think it means, or what it means to me and the way I practice leadership, is being very open about what I don't know, being very frank about the doubts and questions I have when we're considering a decision, and even when we've made the decision, and being very open to the possibility, actually, at every moment, that I could be completely wrong on everything that I believe and am headed toward. And I think one of the biggest tricks of being a good leader is holding that, and also being strong enough to make the decisions, to keep people aligned toward a vision, and to move. But I feel like getting good feedback and getting good input from others is essential for being a good leader, and that to the extent you display some of vulnerability of that type, that's what allows people to actually make you better as a leader. And I've said at various times within Bush, I was like, I don't want to believe I'm good at my job. I want to actually be good at my job. And those are actually two different things.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever used the word vulnerable. I guess I probably have, but when I was asked that, or we were reflecting on it, I asked further clarification on vulnerability. And I kind of thought the way that Jen described it was like a spectrum of vulnerability, but it was about how willing you are to share your failures, but talk transparently about what you do. And as a practitioner in the community, not only am I vulnerable with my staff because I have supervisory responsibilities there, so how am I, and then also thinking about with my community, because I work in a persistently impoverished community, so there's lots of vulnerability there that I feel. So for example, if you deny somebody a loan and then you check out, at the grocery store, and they're your checkout cashier, you're very vulnerable in that situation. But I think we get to walk that fine line in rural communities of carrying that with us. It's also about community building. So on the staff level, what I feel is vulnerability when I'm managing my staff is really being about transparent about what I feel and what I do, and then asking them to be self-aware and reflect, right? We mentioned self-awareness. But I think more importantly, on a community level, we're vulnerable because we have resources, and then we say no to people. And so how are we doing that? And the only way that I can explain it is really just thanking the clients for the courage they have just even to enter our building and ask for those resources, and then acknowledging that and thanking them for that courage. So at least starting at the base level with your clients and saying, you are vulnerable walking into this building, acknowledge that, and thank you for being vulnerable and having the courage to come in here. So I think if you can acknowledge that about your community, it's a good place to start, and you can build from there.
And how has it changed as you've been in different kinds of roles for you?
What, my vulnerability? It's changed because I was the assistant director, and we were mentioning, I think it's in different positions, you don't want to expose all your failings right away, because if I'm trying to move up the ladder in my organization, I'm not going to admit some of my failings right away, and that's probably what a loan client feels as well. They're not going to admit some of their failings. So it is, and you have to be aware of that at what position they're starting at and what the ask is. And while you're having the conversation with people, you have to be aware of if they're saying it for you or with you or to you, I guess. And you had said that as well, right?
Well, just thinking about how different cultures, like workplace cultures or leadership moments, allow for different levels of vulnerability, and It's in some ways easier when you are in charge, right? But it's also can be easier in some environments versus others. And I have had situations where I've acted really vulnerable and it hasn't turned out that well for me. But it does within the context of my current work. I'd also say, though, that there's not any leadership quality that you would say, in absolute terms, more of that is good. Because every good quality you have, whether it's being bold, whether it's being visionary, whether it's being inclusive, like whatever it is that your strengths are, if you're too much of that, it's going to be an issue. So there's, on every trait, trying to find the balance of what's the right amount of this to be. And I think that's certainly true for vulnerability. Because there are ways in which you need people to have confidence in you, and there are ways, particularly if you're representing your organization, you need to appear very strong and confident. And so figuring out those moments where being more authentically transparent about what's really going on in your head is helpful as a leader, and not is important.
Do you think vulnerability is the new humility?
I wonder about that.
It seems the same now that we're talking about it. It seems it's just a new buzzword for humility.
Well, and it may also be that I have a limited idea of it to the extent I'm the one defining it, that people may think of vulnerability as having a little more emotional component or things than humility, about sharing more of your feelings than just the humility, but they feel very related to me.
Mm-hmm. And so where, if we think about it in terms of humility, does it show up differently for you in your mind or your heart, Lakota? What is it?
No, I was just thinking about how I would talk about it to people back home, and I would use the word humility. And that would be more easily, I guess, swallowed, I think, by the community. So, but you could, it's about shifting mindset. So if you wanted to shift it to a different level, you could say, now let's shift to think about vulnerability and how being humble makes you vulnerable.
We talked some about how failure is entwined in this, and the comfort with failure and the willingness to accept failure. And I shared a story that one time I was on a panel around failure and really extolling the virtues of failure and how important it was and how you shouldn't be hung up on failure. And then that same night I was waiting to pick up my daughter from an event outside the school. And while we were waiting, I was playing catch with my son. We were playing baseball, and other cars were lined up waiting to pick up kids too. So we really had like an audience for our little game of catch that we had going. And my son said, "Mom, what I really want to work on is having to jump high to catch balls that are over my head." And so if you're in the car watching us and my son keeps having to jump high to catch balls over his head, what does it look like, right? It looks like I'm really bad at playing catch, and I struggled to do it. I mean, I physically struggled. Like, I would have in my head, like, I'm going to throw it high, and then I would throw it right to him. I thought, what is with me? Like, I don't even know these people. I don't have, like, pride about how good I am at playing catch, like, wrapped up to a core part of my identity, and I still struggled to look not good at something in front of a group. So it was a mini little humbling experience for me on thinking we can act casual sometimes about failure and opening ourselves up, but it's awkward and unpleasant, and that was the lowest stakes situation possible, and I still struggled to do it. So
how do you build those muscles, either of you? Like how do you get more comfortable so you can start throwing that ball high to your kid, or those humility muscles? I mean, what do you do?
As she was saying that, I was thinking about that's an intentional failure, and I was thinking if there's anything in my job or experience that I've intentionally failed at or tried to, like you said, to exercise it. And I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now, but it's an interesting exercise to get used to that feeling, so you know how to react when that happens.
Mm-hmm. I spent the early biggest chunk of my career at a consulting firm called McKinsey that was very, very focused on development, on individual development. And part of what was valued as a skill there was the ability to say, this is the next thing I need to work on. And to say, this is my relative weakness or my biggest development opportunity. And then once you said it, other people then had to support you sort of in working on that. So I got practice in that environment that helped a lot. I mean, helped so much. And the reason it helped was because I was in an environment that was trusting, in which it worked, but then I saw that I was getting better at things. Like I was getting way better at things that I hadn't really actually realized I wasn't that great at by doing that exercise. So I think maybe the practice is finding that person or group of people who you can trust to hear you say the things that you're feeling relatively weak on or concerned about in your own work or leadership, and practicing with them, getting feedback from them, and trying to experience that virtuous loop. And then you can gradually, I think, expand that circle onward, outward.
And maybe it's not like we're using like a deficit language like right now. Maybe it should be an asset language that we should be focused on and saying like, where's our growth areas or our stretch areas? And that might be easier to think of tasks or activities for us to work on.
Cool. So what are some possibilities, opportunities in leadership in rural communities that you're seeing? When you think about the stuff that you two just been talking about, like the changing face of leadership in rural community, where's that go? Where could it go?
We work with a lot of youth, so on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, 45% of the population is youth, so as a CDFI, you wouldn't think that we have youth programming, but due to our market, we've had to create a strategy for the youth and enjoy it. But one thing I always say to the kids, do you guys all know what parkour is? Anybody want to demonstrate? No, I'm kidding. But there's this thing called like, I forget the phrase, but basically, we see an object like MacGyver, if that's familiar, but we'll see an object like a chair and we only see it as one function and we sit in it and that's the function. But MacGyver or other innovative thinkers see it as something that you could take the cushion off of and float it across the river to get a message or something. So I think kids, the older we get, the more we see the functionality of an object. But the youth don't necessarily carry all of those years of experience with a specific object. So what I say is they're like the parkour of our, rural communities, because they can see a different lens of the community, and they will jump over the, cement sidewalk versus walk across it. And I think we really need to capitalize on that as rural communities and grab their mindset and try to wrap our heads around it and utilize that going forward. That's where I see the opportunity. I get really invigorated when I talk to the kids, and we try to do our best, but it is hard because we all kind of shift back into the regular functionality of old objects. So it's just kind of a challenge that I have for everybody and myself.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's nice. We think a lot about leadership at the Bush Foundation. It's one of our core program areas. And being a great leader requires a whole lot of skills. But there are a few things that I feel like become more and more and more important to be an effective leader right now. One of those would be what we usually talk about as an equity mindset or equity skill set. But what it really means at its core is the ability to look at any program, any policy, anything you're doing and saying, who is this not working for? And be able to make that diagnosis and then think, why isn't it working for people? And what could we potentially change to make whatever it is we're doing work better for everyone we are trying to serve? A second skill set builds on that, which is then how do you redesign it? How do you think about the people you are actually trying to help in whatever it is you're doing and make sure you are actually helping them? Because I think we all know in our work examples where that's not actually happening, where we have policies in place or practices that aren't really designed from that person out to really serve and support people as well as possible. And the last one I'd highlight is working collaboratively. And collaboration, I think we talk about pretty casually, but actually leading collaboratively across institutions is actually quite difficult. And there are a lot of reasons for it, one of which is the time to focus on things outside of your own institution, but there are also skill sets that we aren't necessarily trained on how to actually work together with institutions that are different than our institution to get at big issues that are larger in scale than anything we could do alone within a single institution or within a single sector.
Great. Should we see what they want to know about? So, Christy has a microphone. If you want to just raise your hand if you have a question for Lakota or Jen or both.
Or just part of the dialogue.
Or just something you want to add to the dialogue, yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about perhaps one or two stories on a microloan that worked and what difference it made, and perhaps one that didn't work?
What if it's the same story? No, I'm kidding. Generally the microloans we do are artist related, so those are successful. But I'll talk about one that worked but then didn't work, and it was about a prairie dog eradication business, and it worked. But generally we have income patchers, so we have a lot of folks that have full-time jobs, but then they're trying to, income patch because they're not making a livable wage, or they've got a lot of household responsibilities. So he started and we supported him, but we have to add a lot of subsidy to our loans, like equity injections, and we fundraise for those specifically because a lot of our borrowers don't come to us with equity or cash, like skin in the game. So what we did is we had a grant where we could purchase some GPS materials, because what he was doing, he would go out on his four-wheeler and then poison the animals and then waste gas by driving back and forth across the field. So what he did, we bought him a GPS thing so he could go and mark which holes he had already done. So it made him more efficient, it saved him fuel, and that worked well for a few years, but then he became addicted to drugs, and the loan, sort of went bad. But that was after about 3 years of running well, and we're continuing to work with him. He's still a performing loan in our portfolio, but it's a matter of also then now as a lender, I have to work with mental health, referrals and resources. So that's one example of kind of a cycle of a business, and that's usually what we end up being is, following a client through the cycle of their business. So.
Anyone else?
Good morning. I'm Courtney Deinert with Central Electric from Mitchell. Many times in community fundraising, we are tapping the same resources over and over again. So how do we embrace that narrative and empower those resources rather than being apologetic about it? Or is that the right mindset to have?
Do you mean not being apologetic to those donors, or yeah?
This is just me personally. I'm trying to shift from that deficit, like negative thinking and apologizing, even when I'm late for things, like saying I'm sorry, and shifting it to saying like, thank you for waiting and being patient, So to me, it's about just thanking them for being a partner, but I understand what we all feel of tapping the same resources over and over, but I think it's just our own sort of psyche doing that to us, and we just need to approach it from a positive and just thank them for continuing to be a strong partner.
I think that's useful advice, and actually framing it for them in positive terms of their own experience, to say, isn't it amazing that you've been part of this thing for this long, and isn't it extraordinary about our community that we have this group of people who are willing to be committed together for this thing for so long. There's so much about philanthropy, particularly for individual donors, that's emotional, right? And how do you understand what it is for those donors that they value? But then if it's not something that can be necessarily a long-term value commitment, then how do you create that around them? How do you celebrate that as a virtue? How do you appreciate them like it's the 5-year club or the 10-year club, or so that it becomes a really exciting thing to be saying, I've been committed to this organization for this long, something that makes it a celebratory opportunity.
Awesome, thank you. And Lakota, thank you so much for that new line that I'm going to use very often. Thank you for waiting for me and being patient. And my teammates know what I mean. Right? So I think we're about out of time. We maybe could take one more.
Good morning, ladies. Thank you for being here. My question is, how do we encourage our leaders in our rural communities in this day and age of media where it's instantly known, that your failure has been instantly broadcasted to more than just those that live around us? How do we encourage them to step out of their comfort zone.
Are you saying, just a clarifying question, are you saying you want to, because of community failure and the community viewing them badly, possibly, they don't want to participate?
You know, I think there's a whole lot of leadership that doesn't have to be super public, right? And you do have moments where you need leaders to be public, but how do you get people to develop their skills and confidence as a leader in some of the less public-facing ways so that they have the confidence and commitment to withstand some of those more public challenges? Because you know, a whole lot that goes on in communities is actually uncelebrated completely. It's actually the opposite problem. Rather than having too much attention, it's too little attention. Can you take that part to the advantage to actually talk to people in those terms? To say, like, you know, you're growing toward being out and more exposed, and that's going to be hard, and it's going to be amazing when you're ready for that, and you know you've really arrived when you're ready for that, and people are saying tough things about you in the community. That's the sign you've really arrived at a new level of civic leadership.
I think it's a great question. It's really time intensive, even to get ahead of some of the media, the social media stuff that comes out about things. If we would all invest those types of resources to get ahead of it, none of us have. I don't have those resources to invest to do that. But I think it's something we got to continue to sort of wrestle with. But it is about celebrating those small successes with them. That's a great question, though.
Thank you. So, as we wrap up, is there any last thing that you wanted to say or that you wished I would have asked you?
No, I would wrap by thanking you and Dakota Resources for this event. We at the Bush Foundation really believe in the need to actually connect in person for leaders to come together and to learn from people who are doing things like what you're doing, and perhaps even more importantly, to learn from people who are doing something really different than what you're doing. So we value forums like this, and we're happy to get to be a part of it.
Thank you for being here. Lakota, anything?
I appreciate everybody's just vulnerability to have conversations. We don't get to do this often in our workplace behind the desk, so thank you all for that and being here and doing that with us, and thank you for providing the space to allow that to happen.
Well, yeah, and thank you so much to both of you for taking time to get here. I know it was a challenge to, just to cut out some time for both of you, so appreciate that very much. I know, Jen, you have to get back to the airport real quick. Are you going to stick around for a while today? Awesome. And my colleague Lynn has started a new Uber business. She's going to be taking Jen back to the airport.
Really good at it.
She's out getting the car already, I think. Yeah. Oh, there she is. So thank you very much. Would you please help me in thanking these two?